apply. In fact, like I said, we've got a couple of winners, so they can share some of their secrets with you. Those applications should be available on the city's website, usually sometime in March. They're due at the end of May. But since we're going to be talking about water quality, and we talked a little bit about water quantity, that led us to come up with this idea for the speaker series tonight, which is on Shoreview's drinking water. When we were first brainstorming last fall, we were trying to find timely topics, and that was when Flint was in the news. And we were like, well, we're very thankful that that's not the case here, so why don't we have a little explanation of why that's the case? And then we had this situation in Blaine happen, not once, but twice. So Mark can explain a little bit about why that won't happen here either. No pressure, Mark. And Mark sent me his bio and he said, keep it short. I would prefer it that way, but I'm going to tell you a little bit about why I'm not going to at the end here. Mark has a civil engineering degree from the University of Minnesota, and he's been a licensed professional engineer in Minnesota for 29 years. He has been the director of public works here for the city of Shoreview since 1994. And what that means is the Public Works Department has primary responsibility for the production and delivery of drinking water, sanitary sewer, street lighting, and surface water management services, as well as the oversight of residential street reconstruction, curbside recycling, fleet management, and urban forestry programs. Now, here's the part where I'm not going to kind of keep it short because we're going to brag about Mark and why we're so glad to have him here. I work for the Public Works Department in the city of Brooklyn Park, and at our last conference last fall, well, who was one of the presenters? Mark Maloney from the city of Shoreview. And every time I get something in the mail, it seems about the next conference, who is one of the presenters? Mark Maloney from the city of Shoreview. And why is that? It's because of the forward thinking and the innovative things that we've got going on. And a lot of that is due to what Mark is doing. And so a lot of kudos to that. And I hope that is going to come through as we go through the presentation. You'll see how forward thinking this city is. Now, if questions come up, we have a microphone. We prefer probably to wait till the end. And I'm going to play Phil Donahue if you're old enough to remember that, and walk around with the microphone. But all of that said, we're ready for the presentation. Please join me in welcoming Mark Maloney.
Thank you, Tim. Yeah, I think another way of thinking about me speaking at professional agent groups is I think there's a lot of people who are sick of hearing me talk. I hope you're not. I don't join that crowd tonight after tonight. But as we were talking a little bit before the meeting, Shoreview tends to have a really good story to tell about a lot of the services and quality of life topics here in the community. It's why you live here. It's what attracted you here, and it's what we work really hard to keep in place for you, and not just for you, but for the next generation of homeowners here. So if I'm part of that really great, happy story, that's wonderful, but I didn't create it. I'm just, my boss hired me here 24 years ago, and on my first day, he said, it's really a great place here, don't screw it up. That's been my job. So without further ado, the topic that the EQC had brainstormed, as Tim mentioned, last fall had to do with kind of the whole story about drinking water in Shoreview. There's a lot going on both locally and nationally on this topic of drinking water, and the topics just keep they just keep rising up. What I think you're going to need to know about, and what I hope to be able to accomplish here in the next 40 to 45 minutes, is I'm going to help you understand what is the city's water infrastructure. What is it that we actually do here? What's in the ground? How it operates? And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what the standards for drinking water are that we work with, where those guidelines or where those standards and laws come from, and what we do to meet them. And then I'm going to talk a little bit, and these aren't necessarily in order. They're going to these topics are going to move in and out of one another. So I just ask that you be patient through the presentation, and I will stay here as long as any any of you want me to answer questions afterwards. But the last topic that's listed here has to do with the sustainability of the water source. It's almost criminal to me that there isn't more public discussion about drinking water. We tend to only talk about it, I think, publicly. The media jumps on it when there's a problem or a crisis. But if you think of all the other things that we just assume are happening in this state, economic development, job creation, business retention, all those things that we talk about in political circles, they all presume that there's a safe drinking water source. Without a safe drinking water source, none of that happens. And so I'm in an industry of people who get together and commiserate and lament the fact that most people don't think enough about this. And so I applaud you for being here and showing interest in this topic. So this is who we are. For those of you who don't know, Shoreview, Minnesota is approximately 27,000 people. It's an odd-shaped city. It's what you see in this map, both in Shoreview and in the area, a lot of water. Water topics are a big deal in this market. They're a big deal in Shoreview. They have been forever. None of that water you're looking at, though, however, is part of your drinking water supply, at least not directly. So we'll be talking about our drinking water source a little bit later. I like this statistic. This really helps people get their head around why this city spends time and energy the way that it does. But 33% of the area of this city, a full 1/3 of Shoreview, is parks, open space, or water bodies. Right off the top, if you take the area of this community, 1/3 of it just goes right into that category. It's not developable, never will be. That's pretty amazing for a suburb that's this close to the this embedded in the Twin Cities and this close to the urban areas of Minneapolis and St. Paul. It's why indirectly you want to live here. Some other engineering geek metrics. We have 100 miles of streets that are under Shoreview's jurisdiction. There's water pipes under, public water supply pipes under almost every one of those 100 miles of streets. And one takeaway that you'll have from this community is that there was a rapid period of growth in Shoreview in the 1970s and 1980s. And that sort of date stamps a lot of our infrastructure. A lot of the infrastructure, public infrastructure, for the city of Shoreview was born out of the era of 1970s and 80s. It reflects the construction types and the material types and just the thought process that was in place in the 70s and 80s. Well, that was obviously a long time ago, in some cases 40 plus years ago. And so as we continue to preserve these services and enhance these services, we're building on things that were built in some cases 40 or 50 years ago. And the city of Shoreview's water, our status as a public water supplier, we are having our 50th anniversary this year. So we are not new to the drinking water business. We've been a drinking water provider, a public drinking water provider for 50 years. Our public water system in Shoreview serves a little over, close to 8,900 accounts. What some people don't realize is that the city of Shoreview's public water supply also serves parts of Arden Hills, Lino Lakes, North Oaks, and Vadnais Heights. Not large parts of those cities, but they're parts of those cities that are along the edges where it's just not cost effective or even possible to get their own public water supply. In the case of North Oaks, they don't have a public water supply. Any public water that North Oaks is using is being provided to them from Shoreview, and it's along the Highway 49 boundary. So you can see that most of our accounts, the overwhelming majority of our water accounts in the city are residential water accounts. They're just John Q. Public house, townhouse, residential accounts. And you can see we have about 150 commercial industrial accounts and 55 accounts that we classify as public or nonprofit. Back to that 100 miles of streets, we have about 100 miles of water mains. We have 2 elevated towers, a buried reservoir, 6 deep production wells, and you may have heard we just recently completed our water treatment plant. Those are the big parts of our water system. What's not listed here is the 1,000 or so hydrants and gate valves and other smaller pieces of infrastructure that are necessary to operate this giant system that's underneath the ground that you never even see. I included a picture for those of you with keen eyes, you may notice this picture in the lower right-hand corner is underneath the railroad and pedestrian bridge alongside 694 near Sioux Street and Cardigan Road. And if you remember, on Mother's Day 4 or 5 years ago, we had a water main break. This is one of the largest water mains in the city of Shoreview. It's a concrete pipe that is, I believe, 24 inches in diameter or 16 inches in diameter, and it blew apart right next to the freeway. And this is the realities of maintaining an infrastructure that's 40 to 50 years old, is you have to be able to respond to these sorts of things. That shut down water for a small part of our city for about half a day. If you can imagine, we fixed that on Mother's Day, which was a Sunday, and that it was actually washing debris out on the freeway. One of the most curious things I've ever seen is the MnDOT put plows on a truck and plowed the highway in May to plow the mud off that had washed on from the water main break. And cars, and you can see the traffic's going by. So again, just the realities of owning and operating your own water system. So what I'm showing you right now is where our water comes from. A lot of you probably already realize that our drinking water in the city of Shoreview comes from groundwater. We produce our own drinking water. We do not buy it wholesale. It's not piped to us from some other provider. We produce our own drinking water. We have access to the Jordan Aquifer, and our deep wells are in the Jordan Aquifer. What I'm attempting to show you in the upper left-hand corner, that map shows you the extent of the Jordan Aquifer in North America. The blue part of it is buried, and the green part is actually at or near the surface and is essentially unusable for drinking water or lower quality drinking water. The blue part of that is the part of the Jordan Aquifer that's typically used for drinking water. We are right in that little piece of blue. We're in an island of the Jordan Aquifer where it's available and drinking water is plentiful and relatively inexpensive to obtain. It's a big reason why the majority of the cities outside of Minneapolis and St. Paul use that water source. It's relatively easy to get to, and it's a great water source. But you can see you don't have to go too far to the north or to the east or to the south, and it's no longer an option for your drinking water. This layered drawing on the bottom, and these graphics are courtesy of the Metropolitan Council. There's a number of agencies out there that produce volumes of information about where drinking water sources are in the area. This is if you had taken a slice right across the Twin Cities from west to east, like right across the Twin Cities from west to east. And what these layers are different layers, geological layers underneath the surface. This top layer is considered a glacial till. Shallow wells, if you had a private well that was 100 feet deep in Shoreview, it would probably be drawing water from there. We are in this layer. This is depicting the Jordan Aquifer. And you can see it's not even available to the West Metro. You run out of the Jordan Aquifer as you go west of here. And so again, we are in just a pretty isolated area that has access to the Jordan Aquifer. You can see there's these other water-bearing layers that are below. These are deeper, which means it's a lot more difficult to get down to it, and they don't bear water at the same extent that the Jordan does. And in fact, I don't believe the DNR and the Department of Health are even allowing wells to be drilled into those layers anymore. The information here, the text on the side of the screen, is just some notes about the Jordan Aquifer that compared to the other aquifers, it's considered a very high-yielding aquifer. It's why people want to get their drinking water from it. It also is very high-quality drinking water. We'll get into the treatment talk here a little bit, but until recently, the city of Shoreview has not had any need to do anything to the water taken from the Jordan Aquifer other than what's required by law for chlorine and fluoride. So that, again, keeps water rates low. The cost of producing water is relatively low from the Jordan Aquifer. It is, however, somewhat vulnerable to contamination. As that aquifer comes near the surface and there's fractures in geology, knowing that subsurface geology is really important, and knowing about contamination sources and how they may move through these aquifers is actually very important. So if you've been listening to the news, listening to NPR, reading documents, there's a number of nonprofit organizations that have been voicing concerns about water. This is sort of a revelation in Minnesota to some people. We're the land of 10 or 11,000 lakes. We have more water, especially right now. If you live near Grass Lake, you probably are sick of water. So it's difficult for some people to kind of get their head around the fact that there might be water issues. And it isn't just a Twin City metro area. We can't just blame people living on White Bear Lake for sounding an alarm about concern for water levels. There are, according to the DNR, water topics all over the state of Minnesota. Some of them have to do with drawing down aquifers to a level that they begin to impact surface water features like trout streams or lakes or fens or wetlands. In some cases, it has to do with agricultural wells that are sort of fighting one another because they're too close and they're too high production. So there are water topics, groundwater topics all over the state of Minnesota, not just in the Northeast metro area here of the Twin Cities. What I wanted to call attention, and these graphs, these exhibits are from the Freshwater Society, the director of which was your speaker last month. And I borrowed these from his materials. And what this top graph shows you that in the West Metro, there's been a 70-year trend of decreasing aquifer levels. That means the pumping and the taking water from that aquifer out in the West Metro has caused this long-term decline in the availability of water deep under the ground. That's the story in the West Metro. This graph, which shows this subtle but statistically significant increase or rebound in groundwater level, is actually right from the city of Shoreview. And this is why when there got to be a lot of discussion in this marketplace about the possible impact of drinking water providers in this area on White Bear Lake, to the point of naming the cities in lawsuits. That's a very important piece of information. That does not agree with the premise that the city of Shoreview is sucking the lake dry anywhere. Again, the groundwater levels are rebounding in this area, and they're actually at a historic high right now. So again, not to pick fights with anybody or debate those points, it's just the discussion about the availability of groundwater needs to be specific. It can't just be a blanket statement. There are some parts of the Twin City metro area that do have an acute issue or are about to have an acute issue with groundwater. Shoreview is just not one of them right now. So I mentioned these wells. These you may recognize these little buildings, these little square little, sometimes they're brick buildings, sometimes they have some sort of block finish. There's one right in the corner of the parking lot out here. A lot of people don't realize that. We have 6 of these deep drinking water production wells in Shoreview, and they were all built in the time period of 1969 to 1987. So the city of Shoreview has not added any water infrastructure specifically to increase production or increase demand since 1987. We've been sort of living with that infrastructure, that level of infrastructure since 1987, and we're quite comfortable with that. Those wells average about 450 feet in depth. That aquifer, that layer that we call the Jordan Aquifer, to get to the part of it in this area that's water bearing, we need to get down around 450 feet. And each one of those wells produces about 1,500 gallons per minute when they're ramped up and running at full speed. There are very, very few times during the pumping season where all those wells are operating simultaneously. What happens is we cycle them. For instance, right now during this period, this is typically a very low water production period. One of those wells, maybe 2, can satisfy the city's demand. All 6 would be going. Just picture the hottest summer day where everyone's watering like mad. Probably need all 6 of them. Those wells pump the water before, and this is, I'm gonna just ask your patience here. Before we built the water treatment plant, the water system in Shoreview was designed for all those wells, which are scattered mostly just around the community center area, to pump to a buried reservoir that's over behind the ice arena. if you look at Google Maps or you look at an aerial photograph, you'll see a very faint outline of a big circle. And that's the outline of a buried reservoir that's behind the ice arena. So all of our wells were designed to pump to that reservoir. And then what's in this photograph are these 4 very, very large pumps. We call them booster pumps. They're about 4 or 5 feet tall. They're enormous pumps. And the purpose of these pumps is to pump the water out of that reservoir and send it out into the system, send it out, frankly, to the water towers. This is where the chlorine and the fluoride was added to the city's water supply. And it's all monitored with very expensive precision equipment. I mentioned the water towers. So it goes from the booster station, gets pumped out in the system, goes out to the water towers. I've got various photos here of we have 2 water towers, and they hold each 1.5 million gallons. And then there's a buried reservoir that holds 1 million. So we have 4 million gallons of storage. These 2 water towers were built between the years of 1973 and 1983. There's my timestamp again. All of our infrastructure is from that era. And this isn't always understood by people. I think it is in Blaine right now, but this is where your water pressure comes from. The water pressure is not that you experience at your tap is not a function of it being pumped. That's a function of just the weight of water up in the air. Just for fun, I included these 3 photographs of the North Water Tower. Does anyone remember when it looked like this with the old logo on it? Well, then we hired a contractor and painted, and this shroud was to contain the paint because it's sandblasted off and then it's collected. So this is a kind of the sequence that it takes to rehab a water tower. You can see what it looks like today. Up in the upper right-hand corner of this slide is the water tower that's down by County Road E and Victoria Street. That one was repainted a couple years later, and that's why it's got the new city logo on it. The North Tower, the one up by Lexington Avenue, was actually painted right before the city adopted a new logo. And we somehow, I don't remember exactly the process, but we came up with this style of lettering, and then that became the lettering for the new logo. So there's some connection between the 2 towers. Water towers, these towers are made of steel, and they're coated with paint. And like anything steel with paint on it, it breaks down and it needs to be repainted. So these towers each have been recoated at least once before, and I think they're both coming up to be recoated again here in the next few years. It costs about $750,000 to recoat the inside and outside of a water tower. So this is what I was trying to explain to you before, that the wells went to the reservoir and then the booster station pumped it out to the water towers. We have one outlier well that's up by Turtle Lake. It's out there in the Turtle Lake Park across the street from Chippewa Middle School. We have a city well, and that well was doing its own thing, pumping into the system. And so we were adding chlorine and fluoride at that well, and then it was pumping into the system. And the characteristic of that well was it was a very high production well, but it also had, I believe, the highest iron content of any of our wells. And so if we ran that well and ran it all by itself, people noticed iron in the water. And even when we blended it with other wells, it was still contributing a lot of iron to the water. Iron is not a health issue, as you know, it's an aesthetic issue. So if our water was so great, why did we need to build a treatment plant? Somebody asked me that once. Well, for 50 years, we've been monitoring the levels of iron and manganese that are in the water. These are very, very common very common elements that are in groundwater, very prevalent in the Jordan Aquifer. And so over the years, we had been noticing and tracking increases in complaints and concerns about rust and staining. You notice operational things when you have to go out there and turn valves and open and close hydrants, all that metal, the iron manganese is accumulating in those things. And so again, it shortens the service life of these things. And it's really not a surprise. Most of the public water suppliers in this area that are drawing water from the Jordan Aquifer are either currently treating or budgeting for a future treatment plant. And again, it's for iron and manganese. So the city actually had been anticipating building a water treatment plant all the way back to the 1970s. That's why the wells were all put in kind of one area and pumped and directed to the same area. That put us, we leveraged that greatly with the design of the new water treatment plant. It's a lot easier to treat your water when it's all pointed at one place rather than having it going all over. So as you know, we built a water treatment plant. That project was completed and the water treatment plant went online right around November 1st of last year. And its purpose and its point is to treat for iron and manganese. That's all that it does. It has some capacity to be a platform for other types of treatment if they were ever necessary, but we don't have anything cooking. There is no signals or signs of any other type of thing that would ever need to be treated for here. But this is a 50 to a 60 to 100 year life cycle piece of infrastructure. And so you would build in as much capability as you could, knowing that. It can treat 8 million gallons a day. Right now, the city's using about 1.6 million gallons at this period, in the winter. An average day for the city of Shoreview is about 3 or 3.5 million gallons. The highest that was ever recorded in city history was 11 million gallons. That was before we had sprinkling restrictions, and I would just say we do business a little differently these days. In the last 10 years, we haven't had a day that's exceeded 6 million gallons. So 8 seemed, after a careful analysis, that capacity, we zeroed in on being the right capacity. That's the right size for a water treatment plant for the city of Shoreview. There is an ability to expand this water treatment plant if we ever needed to or decided that our needs changed radically and we wanted to produce a lot more water or sell it to other people. But for the time being, this is going to serve, for the foreseeable future, this will serve the city's purposes. It's a $12 million project, which you just can't get an appreciation for through these photographs. Our city council asked in the design phase of this project, they asked the staff, will people be able to tour this facility? And we said, absolutely. And there are things built into the design of this plant specifically with giving tours to the public in mind. We want people to see this. We want people to see what goes on with their drinking water. So this project, I can happily say, was completed ahead of time, ahead of schedule, and within the budget. And it's online and it's functioning. And so that's a really nice thing to be able to share with you, the people who are paying for it. Here's an aerial photograph. This is the ice arena. This is the Shoreview Maintenance Center, and Highway 96 is down here on the bottom. And the new water treatment plant, this graphic said it was proposed, now it's there, but it's right behind the ice arena. And you can see that there's the buried reservoir right next to it. So this booster station, this buried reservoir, these decisions, those pieces of infrastructure were built in the 1970s. So this was going to be the home of the water treatment plant all along. They had foresight in thinking about the city's future needs, and that made this process a whole lot easier than having to go find new land and move water all different directions to get it to a central treatment point. So that's the site of the water treatment plant. I failed to point out this photo was taken from Highway 96 a few weeks ago when there's still just a little bit of snow on the ground. So one of the challenges, or I guess it wasn't a challenge, but it was just a directive from our city council, was make this building look like it belongs here. And it looks a lot like the other buildings in this Commons area campus. And I'm really proud of this city for thinking like that. Make things look like they belong here. It's not some odd looking structure. And it's not that big of a price difference to do it right like this. So this is kind of what's going on now. All these wells, including that one up by Turtle Lake, now all come together and are treated at one point. There's nothing being pumped into the system separately. All drinking water for the city of Shoreview comes through that building over there behind the ice arena. It's all treated in one place. It's monitored. It's all exactly the same coming through that treatment plant. And then it goes to that booster station, which is still there, that buried reservoir and booster station, and then it's sent out into the system. So the water treatment plant just kind of came between these pieces of infrastructure that were already there. This is a fun topic right now. This acronym SCADA, you might be reading or hearing about it right now. Short version of supervisory control and data acquisition. And a real generic way to think of it is it's sort of the master controller program. It's software that coordinates the operation, the security, and all the communication for all this water infrastructure. That last line of text I added in the last couple of days to this presentation because this is particularly relevant based on some news lately. That even with all this technology and even with phone apps that can tell me the tower levels and all the stuff that we have that we can leverage, the city of Shoreview has and always will have 24/7 human interaction with these things. So, for example, one version of the story I heard about one of the incidents in Blaine was that the software running the water infrastructure was noticing the water towers weren't at the right levels and were trying to communicate to people. And there was some break in the link of communication. And because they were relying apparently completely on that link, no one knew that the system was telling them something was wrong. That's one version of some very simplified version of the story. What's different here in Shoreview is that we have someone every day physically in contact with this critical infrastructure. Nobody goes home for the weekend and we learn about it Monday morning. There's somebody here Saturday, there's someone here Sunday. Both of these incidents in Blaine, I believe, happened on a Sunday. And so I've been answering that question a lot lately. If that sounded a little rehearsed, it's because a lot of people have been asking me that question of how is that not going to happen in Shoreview? And I would say that the steps we're taking to make sure that doesn't happen, because we're using a lot of the same systems. All public water suppliers have SCADA systems. We all have communication links. But what I would say, what I feel really good about here in Shoreview is that regardless of all of the technology, we still have real people kind of checking in on things and listening and looking and being able to respond to it. These photographs that I've got in this slide on the lower left, this is a cabinet that you can't really appreciate until you come on your tour of the water treatment plant. But this is a cabinet, it's about 7 feet high and about 12 feet wide. And I don't know what, the stuff in that cabinet is worth probably millions of dollars. And that's the brains behind the flat panel monitor screen that shows you the schematic of all these things. This really busy computer screen over here is a diagram that shows all these critical pieces of infrastructure. It's showing you the water towers, it's showing you the wells, it's showing you the booster station, the level of water in the water towers. All those things are coordinated in that software. And all those bits of information, all that data is collected through this immense cabinet of hardware. And if you are able to take a tour of the plant, I think you'll have an appreciation for how things can go wrong. I mean, it's all mechanical, it's all electrical, and it still isn't infallible. So, do we get to produce drinking water any way we want? Do we get to flavor the drinking water? Do we get to pick the standards? And the answer is no. There is very, very clear federal law called the Safe Drinking Water Act that tells us exactly what the targets are for safe drinking water, what the limits are for compounds and elements and contaminations. And it sets a national standard. Those standards do not vary by state or by region. Those are national standards. So California, Minnesota, New York, Florida, we are all operating under the same federal law, which was created by Congress in 1984. And it's been checked in on a few times, amended in 86 and 96. It essentially looks at things in drinking water as there are primary standards and secondary standards. Primary standards are for things in the water that would be health problems, carcinogenic, anything like that. Secondary standards, the Safe Drinking Water Act has secondary standards, which are suggestions for things which are not health related, but they're things that you would notice. Iron, manganese, Any of you ever had a private well, drinking water out of a private well? So you know that you can see things in water, you can see minerals. And one way to think of why iron and manganese aren't considered primary contaminants for drinking water is if you take a multivitamin, those things are in it. I mean, they're necessary for human life. And so they're not bad things. They just cause other issues in the system or considered aesthetic issues, taste, odor, but not health issues. Again, Shoreview's water treatment plant was built to deal or respond to secondary contaminants, not primary health-related contaminants. All of the detail for this, and I encourage you to check this out through the Shoreview's website. The City of Shoreview is required by law, like all public water suppliers in the United States, to produce an annual consumer confidence, or we call it the drinking water report. And that's delivered or made available to every single one of our water customers. That is actually testing data that's not compiled by the city. It's compiled by the Minnesota Department of Health. So this isn't the city's version of our drinking water. This is objective regulatory agency version of the status of our drinking water. And as we're able to say every year that I've worked here in Shoreview, we meet or exceed every single standard with our drinking water here in Shoreview. This is my alphabet soup slide, just some ideas of who regulates drinking water. The Safe Drinking Water Act was created by the Congress, U.S. Congress, and the Environmental Protection Agency has the general responsibility for oversight of the Safe Drinking Water Act. In Minnesota, drinking water is directly or indirectly regulated by the Minnesota Department of Health, the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources, the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, and the Board of Water and Soil Resources actually has some statutory or rulemaking authority in the realm of drinking water. At the regional or city or local level, you have cities, you have watershed districts, and you have soil and water conservation districts. All have some role to play in drinking water or the protection of water in the state of Minnesota. And if that sounds complicated, it's true. It is complicated. It's complicated, and it's good that it's complicated. That's how I've heard it explained, and I'm a believer that drinking water is so important, it's worth having a lot of oversight. We just can't do it wrong. And we're going to talk about an example here of how it can go wrong. So one thing we're required to do as a public water supplier, and this is a program overseen by the Minnesota Department of Health, is we're required to produce a wellhead protection plan. I'll help you out here. These white rectangles with writing in them, these are the wells. These are the City of Shoreview wells. So this one that's kind of off by itself, that's the one up by Turtle Lake. And these are the ones right around where you're seated now. All these, we're sitting right in the middle here. And what this is showing is that the direction or the drift of groundwater in this area is from northeast to southwest. So it flows from the groundwater. There's water, the water moves through this aquifer underneath us, 450 feet down. And it's moving from up here, up by Taylor's Falls or Forest Lake, and it goes all this way till it hits the river. And when we kind of intercept it on its way. The colors on this map are what the Department of Health considers to be the vulnerability of the aquifer. And those red areas are areas that are modeled to be highly vulnerable areas, vulnerable to contamination, vulnerable to something other than good water being there. This is North Oaks. So what this line here is, this line that's drawn around here is an area that's called the DWSMA, the drinking water, Tom, help me. Supply management area. This is an area that is of particular interest to the City of Shoreview because things that go on in that area could potentially have an impact on our public water supply. And it shows you how complicated drinking water gets. Most of the issues, most of the potential issues for us aren't even in our city. So you start to think of cities kind of as a mosaic in the metro area, all with these little lines that overlap one another, and decisions made in one community should be of interest to people in another community.
What makes those red areas a higher
Fractures in the geology or soil types, the ability for water or things to move downward through the soil to get to that bedrock layer. Those are the sorts of things that are considered. The question had to do with what made those areas considered to be more vulnerable. And they're based on surveys of soil types and geology in the area. And it's an art as much as it is a science. We obviously care a lot about what goes on at TCAP. TCAP is right next to Shoreview. There have been drums and drums and drums of printing ink that have been spilled about contamination at TCAP. And it is not an uncommon question here at Shoreview City Hall, especially from new residents or people who are thinking of moving here. They want to know about, hey, what's going on with your water? We hear that right next to you is a Superfund site, a cleanup site. So what I've got here, this red square is the Twin Cities Army ammunition plant site in Arden Hills. This, just to give a reference point, this is Turtle Lake. And this straight line going up and down is Lexington Avenue. So what this map is showing you is that the contamination plume in the groundwater from TCAP, from all those decades of whatever was going on out there, that contamination plume is very well known, and it's tracked, and it's moved south and west of this area. Again, remember that slide I showed you where I said the gradient, the direction of groundwater flow in this area is from northeast to southwest. That's great news for us. This contamination plume doesn't move towards us, it moves away from us. And there is a perimeter of deep aquifer and shallow aquifer wells that go right around this site. And there's never been anything that's hit that perimeter. It all goes to the west and it all goes to the south. Just a common question when we talk about, people want to ask questions about drinking water in Shoreview. Our neighbor to the west has got a Superfund site, so it's a logical question. And everything that's been tracked and noted since the 1980s has not detected one bit of contamination from that land use on our water system. So, kind of figured we'd talk about Flint. And I will do my best to not editorialize. There is amazing amounts of information, public information that are available to you about what happened in Flint. And I'll give you my version of it as a public water provider. That city got, like some cities in Michigan, got in serious financial problems. And the state, as part of their emergency management approach to kind of solving a budget crisis, put directors in decision-making capacity for the city of Flint. And a decision was made to change the source of their drinking water to the Flint River. The Flint River was known to be different water quality than their existing past water system. It was known to be more corrosive. And it was known that to provide the same level of drinking water as the residents had before, they would need to do some treatment. And decisions were made in that process to not do that treatment. And the effect of that decision was to introduce a different water chemistry to their old aging water system that unfortunately had a lot of lead used in fixtures and in service pipes. And the effect of that the corrosive effect of that new water source caused lead to leach out of the pipes and go waterborne. And you know the rest of the story. And I can tell you that as someone who's in this business, it makes me sick. And I said I wouldn't do that, but we are struggling so much in government in general with trust of people. It doesn't take very many stories like this to just undo decades of good work by public officials and public water providers everywhere. This is just, besides just the obvious horrible implications health-wise to a whole generation of people, this is just going to make it really hard to do this sort of work in a lot of places. So that's my version of what happened. Financial decisions were made that impacted the quality and the safety of the drinking water. And I'm hearing crazy numbers like $500 million to $1 billion to fix what's messed up there in a place that's economically depressed and and 50% of the population lives below the poverty line. So what are the chances of that happening? I don't know. So the obvious question I think that you would have is Shoreview vulnerable to that sort of scenario? And I'll tell you some things that I think are very different about how something like that could happen here. The age of our infrastructure, first of all, tells us that we don't have a lot of lead in it, period. So we're not vulnerable to that kind of health-related change in water chemistry. As far as our water source, we are set. We just made a $10 million commitment in this city to pumping groundwater from a source, and that decision is based on a life cycle of 50 to 100 years. And so there's nothing looming out there that suggests the city of Shoreview should change its water source. It's adequate, it's safe, and we're invested in it. We've been in the water business for 50 years. It sounds like that we're going to be for quite some time. So I offer that as a response to the question of how vulnerable is Shoreview to a Flint, Michigan scenario. I don't believe we're very vulnerable for those reasons. The infrastructure doesn't dictate it, and we're not changing water sources. And then I guess my bias would say that that type of decision-making doesn't happen here. So I'm going to roll into water conservation, and it looks like I should pick up the pace a little bit. Tim's looking a little nervous. If you know about Shoreview and drinking water, you know about water conservation. Shoreview has been a leader in water conservation efforts in this marketplace, and has at times stuck out a little bit like an odd duck because we're the state of unlimited water in a lot of people's opinion. And coming off a couple of really wet years like this, people would say, why should we care about water conservation? We still get that sort of question once in a while. The city has a long and storied history of really responsible decisions about drinking water and our water supply. We obviously have odd even restrictions, and we were the first or one of the first cities in Minnesota to fully implement conservation-based water rates, meaning the more you use, the higher the rate is. There's a law in place now that says all cities have to do that. We had this in place since the 1980s, I believe. So we were a very early adopter of that philosophy. Okay, quiz time. The DNR has a goal for this Northeast metro area, a goal that cities should strive to get to 75 gallons of water used per person per day. So as of last year, what would you think the answer is? So the DNR's goal is that all these cities up here who are apparently sucking White Bear Lake dry, all of us need to get down to 75 gallons per day. What do you believe the city of Shoreview is at? What do you think? 68? Paul says what? You think it's 94? Okay. We're at 68. We're already beating the Met Council's goal, or I'm sorry, the DNR's goal for water consumption in this region. Those other numbers aren't there to shame anyone. Those other names and numbers are there just to show you who our peer group is. And there's a lot of reasons for different consumption rates in different cities. City of St. Paul, if you own a house in the city of St. Paul, that's down around 45 or 50 because the lots are smaller and a lot of people don't irrigate. So that number understandably has a lot of variation in it. But we, in that time period of 2010 to 2014, we were at 68, and I believe we're lower since then. You might already have figured this one out, but compared to 20 years ago, water use in Shoreview, now consider, we have added customers. There's been new housing in the last 20 years. There's been growth in our economic base, and we've actually even added pieces of other cities in. So with all that in mind, we are actually producing less drinking water. Water use in Shoreview is actually trending downward. So we're already below the target that the DNR has established for water consumption for this area, but we're not done. We're continuing to work on this. I have 2 more years of data that I'll soon be adding to this graph, and that line keeps going lower. One of the measures of a public water supply, not just for efficiency from a business standpoint, but also just from a stewardship standpoint. Do you know what you're doing with the water that you're producing? Do you even have an idea? Again, these, you have leaks, you have all kinds of little anomalies in your system. What I'm showing you is a graph of, the water industry has a term called unaccounted for water. And what it means is the difference between what you pumped out of the ground and what you can know for sure went somewhere. So you look at your billing, you look at the uses that you didn't bill for, but you still know it, like if it was used for city purposes. And you can see that in 2006, we were at 15%. 15% of the water pumped out of the ground, we didn't have a firm grip on where it went. The industry standards, depending on who you talk to, are either 10% or 5%. But when we started this initiative of kind of getting a handle on this unaccounted for water, the industry standard was 10%. Well, you can see where we're at now. We're down around 2 or 3%. We've done some pretty serious work in just fixing things, knowing where the water goes, metering it correctly. You may recall, if you've lived in the city for a number of years, you may recall that in 2009, we changed out all the water meters in the city. And that's because as water meters get old, they under-record the water use. And so we've done quite a bit here. Leak detection. You may also know that the city of Shoreview received a state grant for a project called Know Your Flow. And what the premise of this project was, the big fuzzy picture was, the big fuzzy question was, if people had better information about their water consumption, would it change their behavior? So at the point we wrote this grant, most people relied on their water bill. They'd get your water bill, comes, it's every quarter. It could be months since, you used a lot of water and you're looking at your bill and you're trying to make heads or tails of it to say, why is my bill so high? I don't remember using this water. So the premise of this project was, if we put people in touch with their water consumption, shorten the time period, or maybe even real time, give them tools to look at their water consumption, would it change their behavior? And I sold that idea down at the legislature and to the board that funded these projects, and I wish I'd have been asking for more money, because this was so warmly received. People said, wow, what a great thing. Rather than esoteric studies or academic exercises, here's a city that's really trying to connect the dots and trying to put their customers in a position of making meaningful changes to their behavior. So that project launched, that grant project launched. Is there anybody in the room here that's part of that? Okay. All right. Preaching to the choir, as my mother would say. So you know all about this program. So this program was going to simply be, if we gave you a device that could show you your water consumption a little closer to the time it happened, would it help you with your behavior? Right as we were launching this project, we learned about another tool called WaterSmart. Is anybody here active in WaterSmart? We have about 1,100 people in the city that are currently getting these water use reports and using the web portal to see very shortened time period between their meter reads. We now read your meter monthly in Shoreview. We used to read it quarterly. And it could get to be a real long period of time between your meter read and your behavior and your bill. And again, who can remember what faucet you had on 3 months ago? You have the ability now through WaterSmart software, and I'll show you a few slides about it, to get really in touch with your water consumption and see the actual visual impact of your water behavior. It also is a tool that allows you, either on a mobile platform, meaning a tablet or a cell phone, or a desktop computer, to have access to water conservation strategies, videos, how to do it, how to fix your running toilet, things like that. So the real goal of WaterSmart is to have water conservation messaging that's specific to you. Not, here's an example of how water conservation messaging was going on 10 or 15 years ago. We would send you something that said, remember to turn off the water while you're brushing your teeth. Don't water in the rain. You know, kind of apple pie and motherhood sort of things, like everyone should know these. Water Smart is actually looking at, it's using the metrics that are public information about your property, meaning how much water you're consuming, the age of your house, the size of your lot. It's using an algorithm to approximate what your water behaviors are, and then it's reading things back to you to tell you where your water use is occurring and things that you may want to do. There's nothing regulatory about this. There's nothing big brother about this. This is a tool for you as a water consumer. And after this has been in place for a few years, our plan is to go back and evaluate water use trends in the community to see what we've been able to accomplish. This is a big deal on the West Coast. They're under government mandates until recently to reduce water consumption. And so they have to measure how much water conservation is occurring. And this is a tool that does that. So you may see a hard copy paper version of reports that comes from this software as a water customer. You can enroll or opt into web access. And it's cloud-based and it's free and it saves you money. The linkage to our grant was that we were allowed to amend our state grant to help pay for this. So we launched this full scale in Shoreview citywide in August. So we'll have some meaningful data to share and some trends to share in the next year or two. These are kind of this is what it looks like to you. You can see that you can get a paper version of a report. Everyone notice on your energy bill, your Excel bill, you ever see the little chart that compares you to your neighbors and so on and so forth? That's a really effective tool for people like me that are inappropriately competitive, because I want to be the winner. So I see those things and I go, wow, you know, we should do a better job maybe. The water industry is following the energy industry right now in this area. Water conservation techniques are following using those same types of tools and approaches. And it's not shaming, it's just information. And it's for you to do what you want with it. So you can get a paper version of these reports through WaterSmart. As I pointed out, what we're learning is that this is how everyone wants to do business now. My kids won't read anything. My kids won't pick up the phone. Even though it's in their hand, they won't answer it. But they want their information there. I heard a terrifying statistic that 35% of Americans sleep with their cell phone with them in bed or within 18 inches of their bed. 35%. 1 in 3 people want all their information to live through this. So WaterSmart caters to that. There is a mobile phone app that, again, delivers this information. This is what you see. This is, you as a water customer, it's showing you your water consumption for the last 2 years, and it's showing you all these data points are the meter reads that we've read. And it's based on that algorithm using public information about your property. It's making assumptions about how your water is being used. If you don't think that's precise enough, or if you want to be sure, you can go and change all these metrics and you can fine tune it and put the information in it to say, no, we actually have 2 people here, not 3, or we don't irrigate our lawn. And with those inputs, it'll come back and give you better, more refined information for water conservation. Again, this just launched in Shoreview in August. We're the first city in Minnesota to use a tool like this for water conservation. There's an enormous amount of interest in this market for this approach to water conservation. We've been demoing and talking to people a lot since August. So I apologize for running over a couple minutes. When I was asked to speak to you about water, drinking water, I was thrilled because I thought, this is my life right now. I'm spending so much time and energy in this area. And then I actually started to think about it and said, how am I going to keep this to 45 minutes? There's just no way. There's so many things to talk about. So thank you.
Are there any questions? Okay.
Could you talk a little bit about the monitoring of the drinking water? I assume that the water is checked at the facilities that you explained to us. Do you do any monitoring at the household level or the delivery site?
Great question. We are monitoring for a lot of things very often in different parts of the water system. We are specifically required under the Safe Drinking Water Act, there's something called a lead and copper rule, and we are required to go pull samples of drinking water from people's taps inside their house and test for for copper and lead. And I think the frequency or the intensity of that testing just ratcheted up because we added a water treatment plant. But again, that information is available through the city's drinking water report. We've never had any detectable or never had a lead or copper test, hot test in city history. So again, the thing that makes public water suppliers a little nervous about the lead and copper rule is it requires the samples to be taken inside the house. And there's things going on inside the house that have nothing to do with the public water supply. People doing all kinds of do-it-yourself stuff with their plumbing, and the water goes through there and then it's collected in the sample. So lead and copper testing makes people a little nervous anyways, just because it's not entirely a reflection or limited to the public water topics, but that's just how the law got written. So we do that.
Is this on? Okay. So you mentioned the 12 million for that's how much it costs for the treatment plant, and that was taxpayer money?
Ratepayer.
Ratepayer.
Yeah, water customers.
I guess I'm just wondering what determines where that funding comes from, because I know in legislature bonding often, well, it gets proposed to be applied for water infrastructure improvements. So when is it a state funding thing versus a city funding?
That's a great question. The funding requests that I see that come through as bonding requests or the state helping pay for local infrastructure are from areas in the state where there's a disproportionate cost to the project due to something that's beyond the city's control. This is pretty bread and butter stuff. This is, treating for iron and manganese in a metro area suburban water supply is nothing that's going to get any state money. There are state programs that are available, revolving loan funds for some cities that this is a AAA bond rated community. It's pretty easy and cost effective for us to bond for things and borrow money. The cost of money here is low. Not all cities get to enjoy that. And there are state programs that help buy down the cost of their borrowing as well. So Shoreview, is traditionally been a city that doesn't get local government aid, nor do we ever qualify for any sort of state or aids like that.
Hello, Steve. I hope you remember me. Yeah. I'm Uday Singh. I'm a 14-year resident in Shoreview, and I grew up in India, in the desert part of India with a lot of water scarcity, and now I work in the water field. I work for the Mississippi Watershed Management Organizations. The two questions I have, I do water quality monitoring for Mississippi Watershed, but I'm also like an advocate of educating public about water conservation, water quality, what they can do it. So I just moved into the new neighborhood right next to the water tower, and a lot of people were asking me, like, oh, you are the water expert. Tell us, said we get a water softener or not?
Yeah.
So that's what they told me to ask this question to you. That
water softener.
Have you put this water, treatment plant? Do they have to have a water softener anymore, or they don't need that one? So that's the one question. The other question is funny in my household is I have a 17-year-old, even though we have taken him to India many times, but he uses so much water, we are having to pay us back, because when he goes to the shower, he's like 30 minutes. I tell him, man, you've been to Rajasthan, where people don't even get a gallon of hot water, and here you're wasting so much of it. So these are some of my comments. I feel blessed to have, this opportunity here, but hopefully we can do more of this education. I think that's why I feel blessed to be living in Shoreview, that we do a lot of community outreach, and that we are on the forefront. And people like us, go and tell everybody our stories about water.
Well, thank you very much for your comments. And, the water softening question is a very, very common question. My official, on behalf of the city of Shoreview's response on the question of whether or not you should own a water softener is the city has no official opinion on that. It's a function of what you're used to. The hardness of the water as it's produced by our drinking water utility is between 13 and 14 grains of hardness, which puts it kind of right on the cusp for most people of being moderately hard or not. And so if you're used to water that's not softened, you probably wouldn't think you needed to soften it here. Our treatment plant does not address softening. It was not an option that our city council wanted to add as a function or a role for our water treatment plant. Would have added tremendous amount of costs, created a number of operational issues. And as you may notice, we don't have a lot of room over behind the ice arena, and it would have added to the footprint of the facility. We have no reliable numbers on how many people in Shoreview own their home water softeners, but I wouldn't be surprised to learn it's half, probably half the people. Yeah, I've had a house full of kids and young adults that come and go, and their sensitivity towards water conservation is a growth process, I would say. Well, you know, you're touching on a topic, and I get to work with people on the policy level of drinking water topics here in this market. And if you study water rates from this market and you compare them to other parts of the country, we're very inexpensive. Our water is very inexpensive here. And I'm torn. I don't know that it should be expensive just because you can make it more expensive, but I think it makes it hard to drive home the point about water conservation and the real true value of drinking water when you can have 1,000 gallons for $4. That's just, you can't get 1,000 gallons of anything for $4, and water's pretty precious, so.
I know in the past, Shoreview was trying to get people to close off private wells. How many private wells are there in the city of Shoreview?
That's a great question. I don't have an exact number of the private wells in the city of Shoreview that are still there as functioning wells. Wells are permitted by a combination of two agencies, the DNR and the Minnesota Department of Health, and they have requirements for how to abandon them when you want to make them go away. The city never was a permitting agency when it came to the construction of a private well, so we've gotten all of our information sort of secondhand or found out the hard way about private wells. My best estimate is there's probably about 1,000 or so private wells still out there in the city. Whether or not they're capped, I don't know. There's probably about 400 or 500 that are still being used for drinking water. The remainder are being used for irrigation. Assume if you lived in a house that was built before the public water system came by, you were there on a private well. When the public water system was built in the street in front of your house, perhaps you hooked up to the public water supply but wanted to keep your well there for watering your lawn. And that scenario is actually pretty common in Shoreview. But we don't have a real exact number. We can make estimates.
Why was the water from the aquifer increasing in manganese and iron, and then how do you remove it?
Sure. Oh, great. Thanks for that question. There's always been iron and manganese prevalent in that aquifer. I don't know if all those years of pumping it through the cracks in the aquifer just cause it to accumulate more. I don't exactly understand that mechanism. It's something that's going on mysteriously 500 feet below where we're sitting. And it also accumulates in the system over all that time. It's lining the insides of pipes, and it's collecting in fire hydrants, and so it's kind of piling up out there. It's taken out of the water by just, frankly, pushing the water through sand filters. If I can find this quickly, I'll show you the photo. I didn't call attention to it very well, but one of my photos that I have from inside the water treatment plant, this photo in the upper right-hand corner is the upper level. That's the level of the building that's here is where that man is walking, and the water is pushed up to that elevation. It goes in these large troughs that have sand in the bottom, and the water just goes through the sand and comes out. And the sand filter is where it traps the iron and manganese particles. We hit it with chlorine before that process, before it gets to that process to start a process called flocculation, and it causes the particles to get big and they're more easily flushed out. And every so often, the sand filters need to be backwashed to clean all that stuff out. And the backwash goes to tanks underneath the water treatment plant, and it's allowed to settle, and we run the water back through the water treatment plant, and what just accumulates in the bottom is kind of a sludge. It looks like a black sludge, and it's really just iron and manganese and a small amount of water. This water treatment plant was designed, that process of backwashing was designed to be ultra water efficient. There's very, very little water wasted in this process.
Okay, there's one more step there. What happens to the sludge?
The sludge is mixed with a little bit of water, and it's actually put in the sanitary sewer system. And it goes in the sanitary sewer system and gets diluted with all the other sewage and ends up down at the treatment plant in St. Paul.
All right. Well, normally we give our speakers a small gift. Being that you're a public employee, you are not eligible, but we do have a nice card to thank you for your presentation.
Thank you, Tim.
Thank you, Mark. Let's thank Mark. Well, we talked about water, which is one of the ways you can win a Green Community Awards. You put in a shoreline buffer or a rain garden. Next month, we're going to be talking about another way that you could. We're going to be talking about pollinators. So planting native plants is another way that you could win a Green Community Award. We're going to talk about what you can do to plant for pollinators next month, March 15th, here at 7 o'clock here in the council chamber. So please join us then. Thank you.
Great. I'll stick around here for anyone